As we get older, is incredibly complicated, and it's often bizarre, strange, and ironic. I want to describe a situation that was in Israel a number of years ago. We all remember when there were suicide bombers in the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, but a very strange, wacky incident occurred at that time, and it only could occur, I think, in the context of Israel in the Middle East. To know this, to understand how strange it was, you have to know that the March of the Living, many of our kids have participated in it, the March of the Living is not just American kids, it's kids from all over the world, including Israelis, who go to Poland, meet up there with all kinds of other kids, and about 10,000 of them then do the final march into Birkenau from Auschwitz. So Israelis go there on a regular basis as well as our kids. So this happened that in Tel Aviv, a bomb went off at a cafe that a girl named Anat and her friends used to hang out at. And Anat's cousin, hearing about it, called up her family and asked if everyone was okay, and everyone was. And then she said, "What about Anat? Is she okay?" And the mother said, "Oh, Anat is just fine. Thank God she's in Auschwitz." You know, it could only be in the context of the world that we live in today where that would have made sense, in any sense. because there are such bizarre things in the world. I want to share with you a few little items from different statements that I don't know that you've read. In the Egyptian press, this is the formal Egyptian press of the military government. They are accusing, listen to this group, the Zionist American Muslim Brotherhood cabal. Try and put those three together in your mind. Zionist American Muslim Brotherhood cabal of a plot to overthrow the Egyptian military regime. So now I'll give you the other hand. The Muslim Brotherhood officials are accusing General al-Sisi, the head of the military group, of being a Jew. If that weren't enough, the Turkish Prime Minister, Erdogan, said, and I'm quoting, "Israel is behind the coup in Egypt. We have evidence." That's the Middle East. And I want to describe it even a little more. In England, in Manchester, this summer, there was the annual debate tournament of all of Europe and parts of the Middle East and other parts of the world. And these wonderful, smart kids come together to debate various topics. There was an incident with the Kosovar team and the Israeli team where they were just chatting. And the Israelis happened to mention that they had gotten to Manchester a few days earlier and had spent a few days in Manchester. The reaction of the Kosovar kids was, "Rich Jews." And then the Israelis clarified and said, "No, we stayed at a youth hostel." And the Kosovar kids turned to them and said, "Yeah, cheap Jews." Once you've got it in your head of the way you see the world, logic is no longer relevant. Now, if this were all written in The Onion or came out of The Daily Show as a comedy, we would understand it, but this is real. These are real things that are being said and happening. Now, for some reason, a number of you want me to comment on Syria. I don't know why. I really don't. I mean, I'm knowledgeable in a lot of areas of Jewish history and text. I don't know much more about international relations and politics than any of you. I've read a lot of things. But I do want to comment today, but as a rabbi, not in a political way, but in a rabbinical way, because I think there is something that I want to say about Syria and the situation in Israel. In Israel and in Syria, reality is difficult for us to understand because it's so different than our world. It's even different than the world the kids saw. They were in a bubble. They're kept in a bubble. We want them kept in a bubble when they travel to Israel. We don't want them to have to deal with this kind of stuff. We want them to see what it is to live a wonderful Jewish life in a Jewish state and to realize that free Jews have created something incredible in this world. But it's very hard in that world to know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. I want to read to you a piece that I read from the London Times. This was just a letter writer, but look what this letter writer said. Iran is backing Assad. Gulf states are against Assad. Assad is against the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood and Obama are against General Sisi. The Gulf states are pro-Sisi, which means they're against the Muslim Brotherhood. Iran is pro-Hamas, but Hamas is backing Muslim Brotherhood. Obama is backing Muslim Brotherhood, yet Hamas is against the U.S. Gulf states are pro-U.S., but Turkey is with Gulf states against Assad. Yet Turkey is pro-Muslim Brotherhood against General Sisi, and General Sisi is being backed by the Gulf states. Welcome to the Middle East and have a nice day. How do you figure it out? So the reality is, I don't, and I can't, but I can figure something out. In a portion, the Torah portion we're going to read this afternoon, the Holiness Code, there's a statement that says, Al ta'amod al dam re'acha. You are not permitted to stand by the blood of your neighbor. You are not permitted to just watch while your neighbor bleeds. That is a command. That is our tradition. When someone is suffering, we are commanded to act. That's not the American law. If you happen to be at a pool and someone is drowning, there is no requirement that you try and save that person. But in Jewish law, there is. You must do everything you can to save that person. You cannot be guilty of the act of doing nothing when people are dying. People in Syria are being gassed to death. And if any people knows anything about gas, it's certainly our people. And all one has to do is remember that in Israel today, Holocaust survivors are adjusting their gas masks to make sure they will be safe if they encounter gas. And we as Jews know that when international lines get crossed, barbarity is not far behind. Gas is one step. Let me remind you of an incident that took place at the end of World War II as the Nazis, Hitler, were running short on cash and were trying to save money. And it was in the gas chambers and the crematoria that they made a decision. It cost too much to gas a single Jew. So they decided to take the children and throw them living into the gas, not the gas chambers, but the crematoria, directly into the fire while they were alive. Now, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, a few years ago, took time to do the math on this. I want you to know how much it cost to cremate, to gas a Jew. About 2/5 of a cent to gas one Jew. A Jewish child's life was not worth 2/5 of a cent in 1944 in the Holocaust. Now, Hitler never used gas against us, but Mussolini did, and Assad did, and Hussein did. That's the company of people who use it. Hussein killed the Kurds with gas, and there was only one that I know, international person, who cried out. It was Simon Wiesenthal. And he warned, despots will interpret the world's silence in ways the world will regret. It is sad, but it is true. And some still don't get it. At the G20 summit, when the proposal came forward to condemn the use of gas by Assad, Germany voted against it. Germany, who used gas to kill our people indiscriminately and kill others, voted against condemning a nation that used it. And I want to point something else out about today's world that we need to admit here. Something needs to be done. Something is being done. I don't know what the end result will be. It's Jewish approach to try and do something and not to stand by. But I want to remind you of the silence of the Christian world. We live in a society dominated by Christians. Christians have been slaughtered in the streets of Iraq. Christians are being slaughtered in Egypt. Christians are being killed in Syria. And the Christian world is saying nothing about their own people being killed throughout the Middle East. So if Assad is gassing his own people, and so many in the world are doing nothing, what if he were gassing Jews? What if he had still the Syrian Jews? We had a community there for a long time. With great effort and great heroism, we got them out years ago. What if they were there and Assad were targeting Jews? Do you think anyone in the world would be doing more than they're doing right now? The world seems to not care whether people are killed, whether it's guns, rockets, or gas. Why would the world care whether it's by nuclear weapon? Does it really make a difference to the world if Iran gets a nuclear weapon? Iran, who continues to threaten the destruction of Jews and Israel constantly, no matter who their governor is, no matter who the president is. My question on this day is a question I ask myself. It's a question Jean Valjean asks himself in Les Miserables. Who am I? It's for me to decide who I am and how I will act on who I am. When Jonah, the portion we'll read this afternoon, is asked, he says he's a Hebrew. I am a Jew, and I am a Zionist. And I am proud of being both, and I try and live both of those every day of my life. I try to understand that being a Zionist means that I want a land of Israel for the Jewish people, a democratic state that feeds the creativity of Jews everywhere in the world. And as a Jew, I need to do something. I need to speak. I need to act. 100 years ago this year, Menachem Begin was born. I'd love you to read a book called The Prime Ministers by Yehuda Avner to get a different view of Menachem Begin than many of you might have. But I want to read to you just a little bit of what Daniel Gorda said about Begin. Begin understood that life is a messy enterprise, a study in the possibilities of both and rather than either or. Born into war, he never gave up on the hope for peace. He made peace with Egypt, but attacked Iraq and invaded Lebanon. Willing to use force to expel the British, he was among the chief protectors of the rule of law in the Jewish state. Fiercely and uniquely devoted to Jews, he gave refuge to Vietnamese boat people and urged the end to the military rule over Israeli Arabs. But Rabbi, what about Syria? What will happen? This is the 12th year after 9/11. And in the New Yorker, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a piece called Connecting the Dots. And it says something to me about our state, the way we think, and about ambiguity. He said, no one wants ambiguity. Today, the FBI gives us color-coded warnings and speaks of increased chatter among terrorist operatives, and the information is infuriating to us because it's so vague. We want a prediction. We want to believe that the intentions of our enemies are a puzzle that intelligence services can piece together so that a clear story emerges, but there rarely is a clear story, at least not until afterward, when some enterprising journalist or investigative committee decides to write one. Let's list at least what we know. We know the Iranians are attempting to build a nuclear bomb. We know that they have threatened the state of Israel and Jews. We know that the world itself has not yet decided what to do with the gassing in Syria. I'm a Jew, and I'm a Zionist, and this matters to me. There's a movement in our country called the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions. It is very, very widespread on our college campuses, and it's becoming a danger. It looks at only one state in the entire world to boycott, the state of Israel. Not North Korea, not China, not Iraq, not Syria, but Israel, the democratic state of Israel, to shun it, to isolate it, to boycott it. It's not only on college campuses, though, it's everywhere. And if you go to Europe, you'll see it even more. There you have supermarkets that refuse to sell Israeli products. We had a debate in Brooklyn about it, about Sabra hummus, whether it could be sold in a market. There are entertainers who refuse to go to Israel. Roger Waters, Elvis Costello, the Pixies, Stevie Wonder. They've canceled tours to Israel because of it. Alice Walker, Nobel Prize winner, refuses to let her books be translated into Hebrew. We're not talking about going to Israel. We're talking about the holy language of the Jewish people. She will not allow it to be translated into that language because of the BDS movement. And there are companies that we're being asked to boycott around the world. Ahava, L'Oreal, Estee Lauder, Sara Lee, Victoria's Secret. But the biggest blow came recently when Professor Stephen Hawking canceled his trip to Israel, where he had been invited by President Shimon Peres to speak, and he had agreed to give the keynote. And he did it because of the BDS movement, because he acceded to it. He'd been to Israel before. And the irony in this is that he is alive because of Israel. The technology that keeps him living with ALS and allows him to communicate was devised at the Intel facility in Israel. So it's okay for him to use Israel's products, but to boycott Israel. Now, what is the danger of something like that? He's the most famous scientist in the world today, considered a living genius. What happens when others follow his lead? Israel's strength is not just its military. It's its scientific brains. It's its way of developing products and science and technology, biotechnology. What happens when it can't go to convocations? What happens when scientists refuse to meet with other Israelis? What happens is some of the brains in Israel begin to leave because they want to work. They want to use their brains. And they start going to countries that will let them live in them. Now, as a student of Jewish history, I'm going to predict something to you. I rarely make predictions, and this is one you can take to the bank. The future of the Jewish people is in Israel. 43% of Jews in the world live there now. In another decade or so, the majority will live in Israel. Israel is and will remain the future of the Jewish people in the world. And Jews in Europe know this. All you have to do is go to Tel Aviv or Netanya and see all the French kosher restaurants that have been founded by exiles from France. I spoke last night about 2 French women that have come here. But there you'll see massive areas where French are moving, and Swedes and Danish and Germans who are afraid of what's going on. There's discussion now about whether there is a future for European Jews. But there is a place for them. Poland has banned kosher slaughtering and circumcision. Germany discussed that. There are laws being passed throughout Europe that are pointed at Jews. The last line in our prayer book, our Machzor, on the high holidays, is one I want to bring to you now. Not all of you are here for Ne'ilah, but that last line is an important one. It's almost as if Jews say it and deliberately lie on Yom Kippur. It's the same line we say it at Pesach, next year in Jerusalem. And yet, 80% of American Jews have not been in Israel. 80%. Only 20% have even made the trip. Now, most of those Jews who haven't gone have been to Turkey or Italy or France, right around the same area. Some have even been to Egypt, but not Israel. Not Israel. That is a shanda. It's a shanda for us. It's a shame. That is a terrible thing, that after 2,000 years we have a state of Jews by Jews, and we don't go there. Our congregation is better than most, but there are still many in this room who have chosen other vacations. And you heard what the kids said. If their parents hadn't forced them, and they had the greatest experience of their lives, what does it take to get Jews to go to Israel? What does it take to get Jews to invest in Israel through Israel bonds? What does it take for Jews to get active in AIPAC and help Israel politically? What does it take to get us to move? My thoughts today have been heavily influenced by my good friend, Rabbi Mitch Wahlberg, an Orthodox rabbi from Baltimore. He is the rabbi of the largest modern Orthodox synagogue in the world. And more individuals buy Israel bonds in his synagogue every year than any other synagogue anywhere in the country. But I want to read something that he said. 60% of the members of our synagogue, he's speaking of his synagogue, have never purchased an Israel bond. Maybe someday you'll have a rabbi who will speak passionately about Israel, and then you'll respond. But for now, who knows how to explain that? Explain to me how banks and corporations and pension funds buy Israel bonds and Jews don't. Explain to me why Jews don't go to Israel, but Barack Obama did. We demanded it and he went. And you know how he was received? Before he went to Israel, his rating was less than 10%. Most Israelis would have preferred Mitt Romney. But when he went there, it was a love fest. Why? Because he showed up. And we don't show up enough. And that's the question I have for you. Evangelicals go, Barack Obama went, our president. When are you going to stand up for Israel and do something? I want to remind you, this is the 40th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. Those of us who lived through that remember the terror of those first days. The only thing that saved Israel was the United States, under President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, refueling and rearming Israel in the midst of that war to keep Israel able to win that war ultimately. Thank God, to our eternal credit, America stood up for Israel at that time. Where was Europe? Europe not only would not give Israel arms or fuel, refused to allow American planes to cross over European air in order to get to Israel. They had to go to the Azores. Where do you think they'll be when Iran gets the nuclear weapon and it comes down to the discussion? Where will the world be? This is not something we can continue to sit out. Our textbooks, our prayer books tell us we should not depend on prime ministers, popes, and presidents. We can only depend on each other, on the God of Israel, on our young boys and girls that stand the line and fight. I'm a Jew and I'm a Zionist. I am who I am and I try to live it every day. And I hope you are as well, a Jew and a Zionist, and willing to live that as well. So what can we do? This year, like every year, but this year, I'm asking you to take out the card. I want to show it to you. I want you to take it out now. Because there's something on here that I cannot understand. If you open it, that bond card, and you look at the e-mitzvah bond, for $36, the cost of dinner at Avanti for one, you could invest in Israel online. $36. How is it possible that a Jew today does not do that? How is it possible that a Jew will not spend $100 of an investment in Israel to show solidarity, to show Congress, who looks at what bonds we buy and how many buy them, to show them the support that we have for Israel? How is that? I don't understand. I truly don't. Joni and I were blessed this year because of a terrible thing that happened in our lives. When my mother died, it's always terrible to lose a parent. But because of an inheritance from her, we were able to buy the biggest bond we ever had in our lives. I dreamed of that day, not my mother's death, but the day I could afford to invest in Israel at a level that I really wanted to, from the moment I stepped foot on that soil. And all I'm asking you to do is not have a meal at a restaurant and take that money and invest it in Israel and show some solidarity. Do something. I don't know what will happen in Syria. I live with that uncertainty. I'm fine with that. But as a Jew and as a Zionist, I stand with Israel, and I will do everything I can to make sure that everyone knows that, not just here, but everywhere I can speak, everywhere I can find a way to make a difference. And the bonds I buy will help me to show that. So right now, this is what I'm asking you to do. Fill that card out. Push down whatever tab you can. Write your name on it and pass it in today. And if you want to do the 36, then when you go home, go online. Yes, on Yom Kippur. Go online and make a purchase of an e-bond on Israel in the Israel bonds. Do it now. We're going to listen to some music about Israel, but in your heart, ask yourself how you're living your life and whether you stand with Israel. And then give those bonds to our board and to our confirmands. Shana Tova Gemar Chatima.